and welcome to Contemporary Cannabis with Davina and Dr. Swathi, brought to you by the Wrazel Cannabis Broadcasting Network. Today, we are so excited to be here to chat about CBD. What is it? What do you need to know? And what can we tell you? So that will be coming up, but first, a word from our sponsors.
Medicus LP was created after their team discovered that very few avenues existed for investment in professionally managed public equity funds. As a result, they created a long-biased limited partnership, Medicus, for accredited individuals and organizations that will invest in public exchange-traded companies in the cannabis space. Investor net asset values are calculated on a monthly basis by their administrator, Klein Fund Services, and audited annually by Spicer Jeffries. This provides full transparency for investors. Their prime broker is BTIG and custodian is Pershing. Medicus started investing in January 2020. To learn more about Medicus, please visit their website at medicuslp.com. And for more information about their current investment opportunity, please visit the Wrazel Investment Marketplace at wrazel.com.
Thanks so much for joining us today for our conversation about CBD. But before we get started on that, let's talk a little bit about ourselves so that we can introduce everyone to our background and where we come from. You want to start?
Yeah, so if you've tuned in from the beginning, you know I've had a long history with cannabis since I've been really young. But what excites me the most is that today launching a brand in the CBD space, and not just CBD, I guess, it's more in the phytocannabinoid space because our products do include CBG and CBN, and we're looking at CBDA and some other lesser known phytocannabinoids that are being researched and studied. But what excites me is that we're really focused on bringing clean products into this space so consumers can understand what they're putting in and on their bodies, which I think is so important today, and having transparency. And we're including not just CBD or CBG or CBN, but other plant-based remedies, as we've talked about, because there's so many synergistic effects that happen when you incorporate these other ingredients, whether it's topical or whether you're ingesting it.
Right.
And so to me, being able to do that in this industry as things are becoming researched and people understand it is really important. And we're bringing to our products not just the products, but actually the education behind it. So there's really an understanding, which I think is important for people to trust and have the knowledge of what they're actually consuming, what they're applying to their bodies. And so that's what to me is even more important almost in the products that we're bringing to the market, is just the education behind it. And so what about you?
So I also am so passionate about education when it comes to natural medicines. Everything I have my hand in right now is all associated with some sort of vantage point of education when it comes to natural medicines. And of course, when we're talking about natural medicines, a lot of that is plant medicine, especially in the media right now. And so, and the most common of that is cannabis.
Right.
So yeah, a lot of opportunity for us to share information and really be there for the consumer, for the patient, because it's really complicated. It's really complex information with a really complicated, complex plant. So there's always so much to chat about. And so today we're actually going to focus only on CBD, or mainly focus on CBD. Of course, it's linked to so many other topics and ideas for other episodes. But yeah, CBD is where we're going to start.
So in talking about CBD, it seems like you really need to understand more than just CBD, and there's the endocannabinoid system that has a big part in that. We've talked a lot about that in other episodes, but for this particular episode, I think people still need to have some understanding of what that actually is.
Absolutely. So with the endocannabinoid system, what we have to keep in mind is the term homeostasis, which means balance. And so what that means is that the endocannabinoid system, its overall goal is to keep your body in balance, or to keep your body in that state of homeostasis. And so through that, of course, the endocannabinoid system is modulated or influenced by the cannabinoids that come from the plant. So that's the phytocannabinoids like CBD, THC, but it also is influenced by the cannabinoids that are in our body. So those are the endocannabinoids, and that's the anandamide and 2-AG. So those are the most common things, most important things to know. on top of that, too, there are a number of receptors. So there are two that we're very familiar with, likely other ones. But the two that we're most familiar with are CB1 and CB2. CB1 is the one that's most densely concentrated in your central nervous system. So that's mainly in your spinal cord, in your brain. Whereas CB2 is more densely concentrated and more focused and more specialized when it comes to the immune function in your body. So I think that's a good place to start. And then when it comes to CBD also it's really fascinating because we actually don't know exactly where it binds, whereas in contrast, with THC, we know that it has a very high affinity for binding to that CB receptor 1. And so, a lot of research to come, but we do know also that CBD does have some sort of impact on other receptors. One of them that we mentioned in our previous episode is TRPV1, that's located in the skin as well as other parts of the body. So we know that CBD has some sort of relationship with that receptor and some other receptors too, one of them being one of the serotonin or the serotonin type receptors, so 5-HT1A is that one, which we can do an episode on the relationship between serotonin and the endocannabinoid system, which is so interesting too. So I think from there we can continue the conversation on into CBD and what that can really do for our bodies.
So CBD, what is CBD? What is the word that's behind CBD even? I think most people probably don't even know that.
Yeah, so CBD means cannabidiol. And so CBD really is just that acronym, that 3-letter acronym for that really long word. And so, CBD, that's where the name comes from. But then really I think the best way to start talking about CBD is to differentiate it from cannabis. And so that's something that I hear often is people just saying CBD and cannabis interchangeably. And so just to debunk that from the start, CBD is one of the compounds that's found in the cannabis plant. And so as I mentioned before, plant medicine is so complex, and that really is because within a plant there's so many, working cogs and everything, functioning together, functioning against one another. I mean, it's so complicated because there's so many things within it. Whereas CBD is just one of those compounds. Of course, right now it is like the most popularly discussed, and all of that. But I think that is really important to break down that difference between the plant itself, cannabis, and CBD. And then next, I think we can talk about CBD versus THC. Huge discussion also. I've also heard those used interchangeably.
Yeah, they're often always used interchangeably. And I think, too, just to talk about, you mentioned CBD as just one cannabinoid in the plant of cannabis, and there's so many that haven't even been discovered yet.
Oh, absolutely. And as you briefly mentioned in the beginning, some of those other minor cannabinoids too that you have in your products, like CBN, CBG, both have very incredible research that's ongoing and some that's been published really about some of the therapeutic benefits when it comes to those. So we have those, we have that in concert with CBD, THC, all these different phytocannabinoids that come from the plant. So talking about THC, so I think when you say the word cannabinoid, people just assume and they associate the term cannabinoid with certain things. So for example, I think they would associate that with the euphoric effects, the feeling high type of a thing. Whereas when we're thinking about CBD and THC, that's really only associated with THC. And that's because of THC's affinity to the CB1 receptor and that impact it has on the central nervous system. And so you feel that sense of euphoria in your brain.
That psychoactive feeling. And I think there's a concern that people feel like CBD also psychoactive or not?
I love this question because psychoactive is such an interesting term because what it really means is psychoactive. So if we're breaking it down into two parts, so it's active in your brain. That's really what that means. And so if we're thinking about it in that aspect, CBD and THC are both active in your brain. So I would say yes, CBD and THC are both psychoactive. However, the industry now, or practitioners, are really looking to use the term intoxicating or euphoric when it comes to THC. And so if you hear people saying psychoactive, you might think that they're talking about that sense of being high, but just ask a few more questions and see if they're talking about a product that has THC in it, a product that is THC dominant,
Right.
so perhaps that's why they're feeling that way, versus a product that is just CBD or CBD plus other minor cannabinoids, but not including THC, which is called broad spectrum, which we'll talk about a bit more later too. So yeah, I think that that's really important to know that if you're taking a CBD product, you should not expect to feel high because that's not really the way it works in the body, versus THC and the receptor that it's most highly affiliated with, that CB1 receptor, that is where you're really going to get that sense of euphoria.
Yeah, and so talking about that, we talked about CBD and the receptor. So how does it really work in your body? Because it's just such a fascinating thing to truly understand.
Yeah, definitely. So that's like one of the things about CBDs. We don't exactly know where it binds. There's some hypotheses, and of course, we know that it has some sort of affiliation with other non-cannabinoid receptors. Like I mentioned, TRPV1 is one of them that's located in the skin. So we know it has a relationship with that, but when it comes to like CB1 and CB2, it's not fully fleshed out at the moment, and so with that, I think it's just really important to like step back and think about, okay, so the endocannabinoid system is linked to so many other organ systems, so many other neurotransmitter systems, and we know that CBD modulates it. So we know that CBD can have that impact on the endocannabinoid system and so many of the other, receptor systems and neurotransmitters and organs in your body. So I think just knowing that bit of information is really, really it's really important and a good place to jump off from.
So if it modulates your body, is it possible that you can have too much CBD in your body, or take too much even cannabis to impact that modulation that happens?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big question a lot of people have. Like, can I overdose? Can I take too much? Or if I take too much, what's going to happen? As far as we know right now, when it comes to published research, there isn't any study or anything that says that someone has overdosed from it and has therefore been hospitalized or anything. What I've heard other practitioners say to answer that question, though, is that when it comes to ingesting a lot of CBD, it's possible that you could feel like a very high level of sedation or tiredness, because some people are taking it to, calm down,
right, to
perhaps
actually
before
sleep, right?
Perhaps like before sleep. And so, yeah, I think that that's like one of the impacts. So if you're thinking about like the therapeutic benefit of it that you're looking for, so CBD, for example, if you want to take it to try to help you fall asleep in that way, then if you're taking too much of it, then I think you're just going to have that exacerbated effect than what you're looking for. But that's not necessarily anything negative, because perhaps someone does want to take a little bit more.
Right, so they have a more restful sleep, or to help aid in that process.
But of course, in that process, if you're looking to add CBD to your regimen, it's so important to have a practitioner on board. And what I mean by that really is have a practitioner that you trust who knows about cannabis. And so that's really hard right now, simply because cannabis is not taught in all healthcare professional curricula. I know in particular for pharmacy school, I didn't really learn about it at all. And that was a lot of like self-study and things that I had to look into myself simply out of my interest. And then my focus training after school as well. So I think that when we're talking about the endocannabinoid system and we're talking about CBD, that we don't need to be so worried about the overdose.
That's good to know. And how do you talked about having a physician or working with an integrative practitioner. How would you go about finding somebody to help you?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially now in these times where perhaps not going out as much as we are normally used to and everything. So I think the advent of telemedicine is amazing for this. There's so many practitioners that, I mean, if you email us, I can personally refer you to that I know that are working with cannabis clients, or they're working with patients who are specifically taking cannabis products. And they do this through a telemedicine platform. And so what that means is that they are either doing it via video. And so, for example, one of the practitioners I'm thinking of lives in the Pacific Northwest, but some of her patients are located on the Northeast.
It doesn't matter, right?
Because they both have access to Wi-Fi, and so they both have access to that video connection. There are also other practitioners that do it via phone call. So that's another option too. So there really are those options. And then thankfully for platforms like social media, like when it comes to like an Instagram or LinkedIn, there are quite a few practitioners that are posting that they are taking patients or posting things that they're specializing in. So maybe if you just want to reach out and send a quick message that way, that could be another way too.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's tricky because if you talk to your traditional Western medicine doctor, like you said, they have not studied it or been taught it. And so they may advise against it. And it's only because they don't have any understanding or knowledge of how it actually works.
I mean, and that's understandable from the get-go because, I mean, you're not going to recommend something that you don't understand or that has such a negative connotation from the media. So, I mean, I can understand that to start. But, I mean, that's a great way to start talking about it. And I think also with trying to find a practitioner, perhaps your normal practitioner doesn't know about cannabis, but they might know someone who does. So if you bring that up in your appointment, then maybe they could say, oh, I don't, but I have like XYZ colleague who knows a bunch about it, and I'll give you their contact info so you can get that referral too. So that could be helpful.
So as we're talking about doctors and referrals, what has it actually been researched and studied to understand how it works with the body and provide relief for symptoms that people are experiencing?
Yeah, so CBD has been researched in so many different disease states. I guess that's also like a popular myth that there isn't any research. I think what people really mean is that there isn't as much research as like a lot of the prescription medications that we're used to chatting about. But that being said, though, when it comes to CBD, mainly like when I see it in products on the shelves or when I see patients looking to CBD for some sort of relief, they're generally looking for some sort of relief when it comes to anxiety or pain. Those are probably the top two. And then I also think it really helps calm people, and so people are looking to it as well as a sleep aid.
And there's a lot of research behind all of this and so much more. And I definitely think it is a myth because you hear people talk about all the time, there's no research or any studies behind it, but there's so many if you actually look for them.
And I think also people have really gotten used to saying things like that just because it's been criminalized so much in the past. You know, the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 really made it illegal. And so that included illegal to research. And so there was so many decades where we weren't able to actually look into it. So I think when people say, oh, there's no research, I mean, there wasn't research
at
for
some
so
point,
many years. So I guess
only,
it's true.
Only more recently has that happened. And when you talk about CBD, there's isolate, there's broad spectrum, there's full spectrum. And so I know when people are looking at products, there's a lot of confusion and understanding. What am I reading on the label and how does that actually work inside my body?
Yeah, absolutely. So we can start from the most expansive, and then we can go down to the smallest. So the most expansive is the one that's called full spectrum. What full spectrum means is that you're taking it from the plant and you're not really taking anything out of it, except with the Farm Bill, you're only allowed to legally have that 0.3% of THC in your products that you have on the shelves. Of course, if we're talking about a dispensary, that's very different and they can have higher percentages. But I mean products that you would see at your local drugstore or products that you would see in other locations other than dispensaries, that's going to have less than 0.3% of THC. So when we're talking about full spectrum, it has CBD, it has minor cannabinoids like that CBG and CBN we talked about, as well as other ones. It'll have terpenes, which we'll have a whole episode or maybe a series on terpenes. And so it has those, which also have therapeutic benefit. And then it also has up to 0.3% of THC. So it could have less. But generally, that's when we're talking about full spectrum, that's what we're talking about. So broad spectrum is everything I just mentioned except the THC. So it has CBD, it has those minor cannabinoids, it has terpenes. It just doesn't have that THC element, which some people prefer. For example, if they're dealing with, or they have a job where they could potentially be random drug tested, or they're applying to a job where they need to take a urine test. Those patients sometimes opt to go for the broad spectrum. There's very mixed feelings and emotions in the practitioner community when it comes to whether or not the product should have THC. There's a whole group of practitioners who say that THC can be so beneficial with something called the entourage effect, or now it's actually being called the ensemble effect, where so many of the cannabinoids and terpenes all work in synergy and they work together. Just as they would in a plant. So really thinking about it in plant medicine versus extracting and only taking out a few
parts of it, right?
So in that way, there are practitioners that think that way. Then there are other practitioners that say, yeah, of course THC has its benefit, but perhaps for this patient, it's not what we're looking for, so we don't need it. Or perhaps that THC is not really going to add enough benefit that we don't need to look to that, and that we can look to a broad spectrum.
Yeah, and talking about that, I know there's even states where you can sell full spectrum, even with the Farm Bill. There's other states you could only sell broad spectrum, and so there's patients that may only have access to broad spectrum, and still they do get the benefits of it, minus the THC, which is just such a small percentage anyways in hemp-derived products.
Exactly. Yeah, so we covered full spectrum, broad spectrum. So the
isolate,
other one is isolate. Yes. So isolate really is very well named. It's just CBD isolated. It's only CBD. So really some products are going towards that direction where you're really only honing in on that one cannabinoid. Of course, there's those two camps again when it comes to practitioners of should we be isolating it, or should we actually look into the entourage effect, and are we going to get those extra added benefits if it works in synergy with the other minor cannabinoids? So, I mean, that remains to be seen. Everyone has their opinion. But really, it also depends on the practitioner that you're dealing with, too. So that practitioner maybe will recommend an isolate product for a specific condition versus a broad spectrum product, or vice versa.
Right. And if somebody's starting, where do you start? You hear 5 milligrams, 10 milligrams, 50 milligrams. What's a good starting dose, and how does somebody even determine that? Yeah,
I mean, that's like where a practitioner would be so great to start. I know that some people don't have that access to practitioners, so if you don't have that opportunity and that access, you can email us. But if you don't email us also, there's also the opportunity to look into just starting low and going slow. That's really what a lot of people say when it comes to dosing cannabis, especially like CBD products. So, I mean, starting low could be so different for so many people. There are products out there that have such a small amount of milligrams. And of course, the endocannabinoid system, everyone's endocannabinoid system is wired just a little bit differently. And so I know patients that have gotten benefit out of like 5 milligrams, but then the next patient looking for the same therapeutic benefit to, like, let's say to easing anxiety, they actually need upwards of 50 milligrams. So it really just depends the patient, which is why I think it's great to just start low. Start as low as you're comfortable, 5 to 10 milligrams, perhaps 10 is a great place to start. And then from there you can work your way up depending on how you feel. And if you feel like you need to take more.
The Wicked Root's mission is to unlock the healing power of cannabis and create trusted, safe, and highly effective wellness products. They firmly believe that cannabinoids and terpenes found in cannabis and hemp have the potential to positively impact millions of lives, and their team is dedicated to making this a reality. Utilizing proprietary DNA, the Wicked Root offers a brand of pharmaceutical-grade CBD products people can rely on. The Wicked Root team utilizes a full-spectrum CBD base infused with select terpenes to create optimal, science-backed formulas that are consistent and deliver targeted effects. To learn more about the Wicked Root, visit thewickedroot.com, or for more on their current investment opportunity, find Wicked Root in the Wrazel investment marketplace at wrazel.com.
So as we talked about the starting dose and full spectrum, broad spectrum, isolate, Are there side effects that people need to be worried about when they start taking CBD or other phytocannabinoids?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so side effects, again, it's so patient-specific, and that's why when it comes to plant medicine, when it comes to cannabis, it's so highly personalized and highly individualized in that way. But if we're thinking just overarching, if we're looking at the data and what it says, there's a possibility for dry mouth, drowsiness, like those are probably two of the top ones. Perhaps dizziness is another one, and it could also give you a certain element of fatigue and make you feel a little bit more tired.
Right.
So those are some of the top side effects. They're not really anything that I'm very worried about, depending on the patient, unless they have some sort of condition that I'm worried about. But otherwise, yeah, there's not that many side effects overall. And again, it really just depends.
Right.
And it really depends.
And that's really towards more the ingestibles, right? Because if you're putting topicals, and I have talked to people and they're like, well, what is it going to do if I put it on my skin? I promise you're going to be okay if you put it on your skin.
That's a really good distinction, because when it comes to the topical absorption, that's a question I think that a lot of patients would have when it comes to, like, if they are worried about the urine drug test at work, or they're applying to that new job that they really want, that's not something to necessarily worry about, because when you're doing it topically, that's the best part about it, is that you're really getting that local effect.
Right.
So if you're using it for joint pain or for arthritis, then you're going to get that impact and that effect really on that joint. So that's really great. And so it's not something that I'm worried about when it comes to systemic absorption or really getting into your circulatory system and really having that effect. So even that 0.3% of THC, overall, it's not something I would be worried about when it comes to a topical product. And when I'm saying THC, I mean like a full spectrum product. So having CBD, other minor cannabinoids, having terpenes, and having up to that 0.3% of THC. So, I mean, if you want to be very hypervigilant, then avoid it.
Right.
But overall, it's not something I'd be too concerned with.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, I mean, we've covered such amazing topics today talking about CBD. There's so much information, and I know we'll continue talking about more. I think each of these topics in itself could be a whole session just specifically about it, but I think it gives a really good overview about CBD and how it works within your body, and just some of the information that's associated with it in terms of products and where do you start and how do you use it.
Definitely. And in the next episode, we'll talk about drug interactions when it comes to CBD in particular, and then I might also talk about some other cannabinoids and the drug interactions. So by drug interactions, I mean if you're taking other drugs, if you're taking other, whether that's prescription medications, over-the-counter medications like dietary supplements, herbs, if you're taking any of those, what drugs are we worried about interacting with, or what of any of that list are we worried about interacting with our cannabinoid therapy? So that's coming soon.